Okay. So this is in Thinkman. It's a think tank, and we go deep into philosophical matters. And today we're going to look at Aristotle and a little bit of Heidegger. So Sabine will do Aristotle. She may not be want to be on the air. We're going to ask her if she wants to be on the air, wants to be recorded. So she's going, okay, why not? And then when she's done, and she doesn't have to rush it, she can take the whole time if she wants. Then I'm going to do Martin Heidegger and his book on mindfulness, which I think is a trip, a real trip. And we'll actually, oh, you got, I gave Sabine a copy, an extra early birthday present, Sabine. For,
Very early, but it's lovely. Thank you. I will get
I mean,
started.
who gives Heidegger as a present, Any, anyway, so we'll spend a little bit of time, but I think it actually opens up the things Ronnie and I did in the book, and uh, and I appreciate that. So Sabine, anytime you're ready to go is fine.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. And thank you so much for everybody who is here. I appreciate you so much. I would like to talk about Aristotle, who lived from 384 BC to 322 BC. And what I want to talk to you about today is Aristotle's Poetics. It's called Aristotle and the Art of Poetry. And this is a translation by Ingram Baywater, Oxford, 1909. I wish I could read the Greek. I can't. Sorry about that. For the benefit of those who were not here last time I presented, I will go over some of the things I did go over before, but not everything. But I want things to connect and make sense. So for the ones who were here last time, bear with me, please, and I apologize. Aristotle Poetics. He says that the arts are a mere imitation. And what do they imitate? They imitate people, they imitate emotions and acts. And how is this done? And he calls this the means of imitation. And then he lists them. What are these? The means of imitation are, first of all, rhythm, a repeated pattern. And this can be sound, movement, and I would like to add in the visual arts, the patterns of forms and lines. Rhythm. In language, of course, in poetry, we have the meter. We will get to that a little bit later. The second means of imitation is language slash diction, of course. Third is harmony, and this is defined as order, balance, relationships that are pleasant to look at or pleasant to hear. The objects of imitation. So let's go a little more deeply into this. Who and what is imitated in tragedy in plays? Well, what is imitated, what you see on a stage, are actions and agents. But what Aristotle really stresses is character, the character, the moral values of the people on the stage. It's virtue and vice. And he describes it as, good men and bad men. Of course, today we would add good men and good women, but in Aristotle's day, they did not think this way. So virtues are very important. We'll get to that later. So this plays into values. What is the moral compass? We talked about, morality, ethics in this group before. And according to Aristotle, a play should have 6 elements to it. And he ranks them in order of importance. The most important one, number one, is the plot. He calls this the most important element. And this is, he calls this a combination of incidents, if you will, the story. And that is of prime importance. Second in the order of importance in his mind is the character. And I quote, that which reveals the moral purpose of the agents. That means the sort of thing they seek or avoid. So does a person do moral acts, immoral acts? Are they not willing to do bad things, or are they willing to do bad things? Third is thought, and that is an expression of a main point. Like, shall we say, the moral of the story? A point to be made about, as he puts it, some universal proposition. There has to be a meaning, a major point to a play. Fourth is diction, and that is, of course, language. We will get back to that later. Fifth, we have melody. And in ancient times, a chorus was always part of these performances. And he wanted that to be an integral part. The chorus was like an additional character, actually, in ancient times. 6 is spectacle, and those are the visual aspects of a performance. Those are the costumes, the scenery. Today in movies, these would be special effects, if you will. And he said this is the least artistic of the 6. Because, of course, you can always get somebody's attention by spectacular visuals, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a good story. And it's not, in his mind, a good play if all you have is special effects, but not a good story or a good plot. A tragedy should be a unit, and he says it should have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Now, let's get to unity. What he means by that is that there should be nothing superfluous in it, that everything is there for a reason. And I'm sure you've all seen movies like that where you feel, oh my God, I don't know why that is there. But then the good movies, like, the threads all come together at the end. It's a whole that, where you can't cut anything out or not even reverse the sequence of things without destroying the entire work. A plot, according to Aristotle, can be complex or simple. A complex plot is a plot that contains what he calls peripety or discovery. And what is peripety? In a plot, it means a change, a turnaround from one state of affairs to its opposite. Somebody being not successful and becoming successful, or vice versa. Somebody being happy to becoming unhappy. So here we would have tragedy in the latter case, of course, somebody going from happiness to being in complete misery. So there should be a turn in a play that is complex. And the other thing is that it should have is a discovery. There needs to be a discovery of something that could be knowledge, a discovery, okay, let me quote here, a change from ignorance to knowledge, but this can also mean from love or hate, from love to hate, or vice versa. So a discovery really is discovering knowledge, knowing something about somebody. And this, in a tragedy, it's usually what you discover is usually a bad thing. For example, there's a character who has a good friend whom he or she trusts, and it turns out that that person lied and betrayed that trust of that person. So that would be, a discovery in that sense, finding out something about a character. Aristotle believed for a good tragedy, you should have both. You should have a reversal of fortune. And of course, in tragedy, that means something bad is happening. You're going from good to bad. And it also should have, a discovery in it, finding out something. And usually in tragedy, of course, it is something bad. He favors a complex plot, which has both discovery and peripety. Now, I would like to get to something that I found very fascinating, and that is the goal. What is the goal of a tragedy? It's to elicit emotions. And he said, well, the goal really is to elicit either pity or fear. But it really matters who we're talking about, because if something bad happens to a bad person, we have neither, he says, which makes sense. If a bad person meets with a bad fate, well, we kind of feel, okay, that person deserves it because this was not a good character. However, if bad things happen to a good person, well, then of course we feel that pity and empathy. But he said for a good person, to have bad things happen to him or her, that is, of course, it's just odious, he says. We find that just terrible that we feel disgust actually more than pity and fear. That is his point. Um, but he said in tragedy, the best approach is to use a person who is neither terribly good nor terribly bad, just like an average person. And he felt that the most impact on stage is made when an average, not so good, not so bad person is making an error in judgment. That is when we can really be feeling it and feel sorry, feel the pity, and also a degree of fear because this might happen to us. Oh my gosh, I could have done this very same thing. This could have happened to me. Now, I want to get to another point he is making, and that is that the causes of the misery in a tragedy should always be included, so you should have a reason. The reason should be mentioned or shown why the character is miserable. And he is putting in horrible acts as, a reason, obviously, to miserable. And he goes to things like, murder, torture, and the like. And he says here also, it makes a big difference what the relationship is between the characters that, who is performing the horrible act and who is at the receiving end of it. And of course, that determines how we react to it. And he said, well, if two enemies are doing horrible things upon each other, well, we expect that, right? There's nothing that's too earth-shaking about that. However, he said, for the most impact on stage, what you want to have is, and this is really awful, you want to have horrible acts committed by one family member upon another. And it's like, oh God, right? So, like, a brother murdering a brother or a sister killing, her brother, things like that. He said that is the most impactful on a stage. The part that I really find the most appealing in all of this is the characters and the connection that Aristotle makes to values, moral values. I really like that. And I'm also thinking about, how does this translate to real life? What can we learn from that in real life? Because it is imitating life. A play is imitating life. For characters, he wants to have good characters in there. Characters who have a good moral compass. And as he put it, of course, in translation, and I quote, moral purpose. And he felt it was important that their acts and their speech on stage align with that. So that, of course, the moral values are reflected in what they do and what they say. Now he's going into various ways of discovery. I think I'm going to skip that part. Um, then he is going into language a bit, what he calls diction. And for the poet, he has actually some advice, and it seems almost modern to me in its tone, shall we say? Because one of the recommendations is that the poet who is writing this should actually mentally visualize the scenes, have that before his or her eyes, and that will make his or her writing more realistic. And the second point is not only visualization, but Aristotle recommends actually enacting. He said the poet should actually, put himself or herself in the shoes of the character and do the motions and actually through the motions feel feel the emotion. And Aristotle felt that by doing that, the language will be more powerful. When the poet himself actually feels the emotion, that the words will come out in a more convincing way. I can just see, a poet sitting there, it's like, wow, wow, and, okay. And I thought that was an interesting point he was making to like really feel it, enact it, while you don't just sit there, but act it out while you're writing this so you really get the feeling as you're writing. Now, of course, diction and thought, as we mentioned before, actions, thought, and language, they must all align because otherwise it's just not particularly convincing, right? It all must go together. Then there's quite a big section in the book about what we today would, I guess, call grammar, right? So he goes into the parts of speech, into nouns and verbs and sounds, and it's quite a reasonably sized section in there. But in fact, it was actually Aristotle's teacher, Plato, who preceded him in this, in distinguishing between the parts of speech, such as, nouns and verbs and such. So that was about, Aristotle and language. So he's giving advice, more advice to poets, like we did, right? We saw with the gestures, there's more advice. And he said, well, don't be too obscure in your language. If your language is too obscure, it actually distracts, it takes away, so don't be overly complex. And it was almost like if you have to use complex language, use it when you need it like as a filler, So I mean, I thought that was kind of funny. um don't use it when you have something real, like character that elicits real emotion. Don't get complex with your language. Now I would like to finish off with two things. One of them is a quote. And I really like this one too, because it deals how we receive something that is said. And I think that is very relevant for what we even do in real life, not just a play. Of course, he's talking about our reaction to a play or to poetry, but I think there is some wisdom in this for real life. So let me read this quote to you. As for the question whether something said or done in a poem is morally right or not, in dealing with that one, in dealing with that, one should consider not only the intrinsic value of the actual word or deed, but also the person who says it or does it, the person to whom he says it or does it, the time, the means, and the motive of the agent, whether he does it to attain a greater good or to avoid a greater evil. So that means on the surface, right, something can look wrong or evil, but unless we know why it is done, right, it isn't necessarily evil. If we, let's say, if somebody gets saved because of an act that looks on the surface of it awful and immoral. So I think it's about looking, at much more than the words and the deeds. And I think that, to go deeper, the motive, why something is done, who says it, why, to whom. I think that is really, I love that, to look at the greater instead of jumping to a conclusion. Oh, this is really bad. Well, hold on a minute. We don't know yet until we know more. There is one very last point that I would like to make that he threw in there, and that is actually about logic. He said that in a play, things should follow from one another, where you have an action and that action has a consequence and so on. And he gave a little piece of logic in here in that context. And that is called paralogism. And what does that mean? In logic, it means wrong reasoning. So on the surface, again, something can look logical, but it actually isn't. And I had my husband, David, help me with this a little bit because he's actually quite good at logic, and I have a lot of work to do in that department. But here it goes. A, and then there's a consequence, B, right? So the famous example is if it is raining, the sidewalks are wet. Okay, that is, okay, that's fine. However, you cannot go and assume that A is necessarily true. I mean, if it is raining, we cannot say that the cause of it, hold on, no, if the sidewalk, sorry, I'm getting myself mixed up here, I apologize. if the sidewalks are wet, we cannot assume that it is raining because several other causes are possible. The sidewalks might be wet for an entirely different reason. It could be because it rained, but it also could be because somebody washed the sidewalk off. Somebody, spilled something, the sprinklers were on, so I mean that, we cannot go and assume that it was actually rain. When we see wet sidewalks, we cannot assume that it was rain that necessarily caused it. And that thinking, when there are several possibilities for, the sidewalks are wet, that is called paralogism because, we have several possibilities. There's the obvious explanation, but the obvious explanation is not necessarily true. Thank you. I appreciate your listening. Thank you for your attention. And if that sparked any thoughts, questions, my big question is how does this apply to, say, counseling, coaching, our own making judgments? What can we learn from this in real life?
Well,
Thank you.
thank you, Sabine. Let's thank Sabine and come off mute and say hello. And uh, I'm still recording, so I'll let you know that. But thank you very much. In fact, I think what I'll do is